I'm Aninda. I'm a social scientist and I care about environment. This time around, I'm stepping out of my comfort zones to familiarize myself with numbers and learn about data. This project is part of my learning outputs on fundamental statistics, which I had a great fun working on. You may expect to see some historical, social, and political insights from my visualization. Do you feel that the weather is getting more extreme by the day? Have you observed some of the islands disappearing due to the rising sea level? This all happened due to the rising amount of greenhouse gas from carbon dioxide emission, or we call it carbon emissions. CO2 emission can come from many sources, but the prominent one is from fossil fuels. These emissions are stuck at the ozone layers and make the Earth warmer. Scientists agree that the Earth's temperature will be as high as 2 degrees Celsius by 2050. It may be seen as a low number, but even with the 0.5 degrees increase, it will impact the severity of heat waves, rainstorms, and rising sea levels. Such a bad news, right? But the Earth is not flat. There are many countries and companies and people around the world consuming fossil fuels. They contributed to the carbon emission differently, depending on geographical locations and regulations in the given country. In this project, we will look at how much emission are reproduced globally, and with a particular case study of Indonesia, we will look at what to do to reduce the emission. By taking a multi-level approach, this analysis first will explain global historical trends of carbon emissions and the picture in ASEAN. And using Indonesia as a case study, it will provide a deeper examination on the prominent fossil fuel emitters and the correlation between fossil fuel and carbon emissions and the projections of 2030 by different carbon reduction effort scenarios in Indonesia. For this project, I utilized three main datasets. The first two I got from Kaggle, and the last one I got from British Petroleum Statistical Review of World Energy 2022. The first dataset consists of total CO2 emissions in 232 countries worldwide from 1750 to 2021. It contains 11 columns and 6,305 rows, which each row corresponds to a particular country, and each column represents a different attributes or variables describing the amount of emissions. The total amount of CO2 emissions counts emissions from different sources, such as fossil fuels, and also manufacturing industries, such as cement and flaring. So I indicated the variable with like their particular names, such as country, year, per capita, total. And for emission production, I use their original name, coal, oil, gas, cement, flaring. And for consumption, I added underscore consumption, such as like coal consumption, oil consumption, gas consumption. So the second data set has similar feature, but the number shows are emission per capita, meaning the CO2 contribution of the average citizen of the country. The last data set from British Petroleum aim to robust the analysis by providing numbers of consumption for several fossil fuel sources, which is coal, oil, and gas. So in this particular project, I combine the data set to find comprehensive data on CO2 emission. And to see the most recent development, I specify the time period from the first global oil crisis in 1973 to 2021. So let's take a look at the insights from the data visualization. The first question that I asked was, how globally have carbon dioxide, CO2 emissions, trended over the years? Among fossil fuel sources, what are the two largest emitters? Let's see the time series graph on the screen, on the left-hand side of your screen. It shows the total CO2 emissions since the 1970s. The oil crisis in 1973 and 1979 has helped stabilize the emission for a few years, but it quickly increased again. Kyoto Protocol, a global agreement that was supposed to push countries worldwide to reduce emissions, had taken a long time to be adopted, and instead it experienced a steep increase in emission. So you can see here from the graph the trends, right? And when the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015, there was a slight peak that was right before the COVID-19 pandemic hit the world and minimized mobility. The pervasive disruption of the COVID pandemic have radically altered the trajectory of the CO2 emission. So you can see the fall of emission by almost 25,000 megaton CO2 equivalent in 2020. From 1973 to 2001, that you see in the graph below, the coal contributed to the largest amount from the fossil fuel sector. In the bar chart, you can see that oil is following coal on this matter. The bar chart shows the number of emissions produced by coal and oil is comparable by around 12,000 megaton CO2 emission, equivalent. Since I live in Southeast Asia, I wonder what the graphs look like for ASEAN member states. Who does produce the largest amount of emissions? So I decided to filter the country data to cover 10 ASEAN countries. So the two bar chart that you see on the screen now is capturing the emissions from 10 ASEAN countries. The one at the top is emission per capita, and the one at the bottom is total emission. The first graph shows that Brunei Darussalam has the highest emission per capita, meaning that on average, each citizen of Brunei Darussalam contributes 1,082 megaton CO2 equivalent of carbon emission. Indonesia is ranked number 5 after Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand on emission per capita. So this is likely due to different sizes in terms of population and geographical location. Brunei is very small, while Indonesia is very big. But when it comes to total CO2 emissions from 1973 to 2021, Indonesia produced the largest amount in the region. As mentioned, the emission may come from different sources such as fossil fuel, manufacturing industry, forestry, and even household. But this amount here is almost double that of Thailand, the second largest emitter. So you can see Thailand has 7K plus of emissions, and Indonesia is almost 14,000, almost double. Again, geography and demography matter. Let's zoom in on Indonesia. What are the top 2 fossil fuel emitters and how have they contributed to the country's emission over the years? Well, in the previous graphs, we have learned that coal was dominating as the world's top carbon emitter. The picture is quite different in Indonesia. The bar chart below shows that oil contributes the most emissions as compared to other sources. But how come? Let's see the development of coal and oil emissions in the time series graph further below. Oil has been consistently dominating as a top emitter in Indonesia since the 1970s. But then the growth have started faltering in 2012. And then when the oil prices crashed in 2018, it came way down. Meanwhile, the emission growth from coal has been escalating rapidly ever since. Then people talk about greenhouse emissions caused by carbon dioxide derived from fossil fuel sources. But you might wonder, is it true though? To understand how best to reduce the CO2 emissions in Indonesia, it will be helpful to analyze the correlations between fossil fuel consumption and CO2 emission. A scatter plot will help us to understand the correlation between the two variables. So let's see here. The first scatter plot is on coal, second is on oil, and the third one is on gas. You can see it shows a strong positive correlations in all 3 graphs. With coal has the strongest positive correlation, and gas has the lowest, but still it's still strong, right? And from the graph here, from the scatter plot here, we can see that the consumption of fossil fuel sources has a strong positive correlation, minimum 0.87, to the total emission, with coal having a most perfect positive correlation. This means that fossil fuel consumption is indeed highly contributing to total CO2 production in Indonesia. At this point, we may ask, what's next? In the Paris Agreement in 2016, Indonesia submitted nationally determined contribution, which was later updated to indicate its greenhouse gas target. So in the I include all the target scenarios on the line graph here with the forecast data up to 2030. So in this graph, we can see how it looks like for Indonesia in 2030 in three different scenarios. The first one is business as usual, meaning that we don't do anything to reduce emissions. And the second one, if Indonesia relies on its own efforts to reduce emissions, so it doesn't get any assistance from anyone else, and then it will be reduced 31.89% of emissions. And the last one, if the country gets international assistance, the reduction will be up to 43.2%. While the second one only cuts slightly more than 155,000 metaton CO2 emission, CO2 equivalent, the last scenarios will cut more than 1/3 of the total carbon emission in 2021. You can see the numbers here. From the previous analysis, we have got several insights. Globally, among 232 countries, there has been an increasing trend of carbon emissions. Many historical events have slightly reduced emissions, yet only face failure as it has been growing upward. Second, coal and oil are top two fossil fuel emitters in the world. In Indonesia, the largest emitter in ASEAN, oil and coal also has a role as a top producer of CO2 emission. Third, there is a strong correlation between fossil fuels consumption and CO2 emissions. It means that the more we burn fossil fuels, the more CO2 we produce. Lastly, based on the projection, the scenario that will be implemented by the government of Indonesia might bring us to travel back in time up to 2010. We do understand that the world needs to keep its temperature low by reducing carbon emission in order to live a livable planet. Now we ought to ask, what's next? What should we do? Here are some of my recommendations for policymakers, businessmen, activists, or anyone out there who cares about environment. First, in keeping the growth of global CO2 emissions faltering, we need to create a breakthrough in the global consumption of fossil fuel. One of the ways is to boost the adoption of renewable energy sources, such as solar and wind, and make them affordable and accessible for common people. Second, the global consumption of coal and oil, among other fossil fuels, has to be cut down significantly to reduce carbon emission. Most importantly, in Indonesia, coal power plants and oil refineries need to be phased out while at the same time developing low carbon technologies. Lastly, Indonesia should gain more and more international support in order to be able to reduce emissions by half or even more. The support could be in the form of low carbon technological innovation or carbon offset initiative from the nature-based solution, or maybe knowledge production in climate change adaptation and mitigation. But most importantly, don't forget, we have to make sure the equity and justice for this climate efforts. That's the end of my project. I hope you enjoyed it. And I would like to thank Petman.ai and the team at the Intro to Dataviz class team, Mas Faisal, Mas Rafli, Mbak Ulfa, who have been giving me guidance on how to create this fun data visualization project. See you next time. Thank you.